becomes a bigger thing because fame is tricky because you read what's said about you, then you know what you know to be true, and the lines start to blur.
Going into a kind of a deep dive into the media. I've been paying attention to some of the news over the last over my entire life actually, but over the last year especially, kind of watching how everything is unfolding, or the last 2 years really, since the pandemic. I mostly stopped watching the broadcast news since April of 2020 because I got burnt out on everything had to be coronavirus related. And I get it. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Like, I don't think it's a plandemic. I think it's an unplandemic, and all the politicians are kind of dropping the ball on and using it to promote their own agendas. But I mean, it certainly is a real thing. I can't spend my entire life just sitting around watching everything about the pandemic. And besides that, I mean, over the last year, there's been some crazy stock market news. I've watched, a lot of that mostly. And there's been a bunch of rioting or protest, however you want to look at it, that's been going on with legal things. And I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan of political news in the first place, political media, but I have worked in the media for a very long time. So I'm going to kind of break down some of how the media works on everything that I've seen over my lifetime of what I understand of the media. And it's a long kind of story. This is going to be kind of a long video, and I apologize for that. But here, let me pull up one of these statistics real quick. This is from Pew Research. And what Pew Research has found out, this is one of the issues that we're facing over the last decade, especially from 2008 until this particular study was published in the summer of 2021. But during that time frame, that 13-year time frame, or 12 years, I guess it is, however you want to look at it, the newsroom employment in the United States has declined by 26%. And what's been going on during all that time frame is that you have two things that have been happening. On one end, you have a lot of the local news has been essentially it's been centralized. So you've got places like Gannett or Times Media that own huge portions of local news throughout all of the middle America, basically, all the small towns that aren't that big. And they centralized a lot of things. A lot of the local journalists have been kind of shut out. And then you have another thing going on where you've got, on social media, you've got a lot of citizen journalists and independent journalists who are making their own way. And this is causing everybody to basically be able to find whatever type of news they want to find, and it'll kind of have a confirmation bias to it, that you get some news that will confirm basically what you already believe. And there's a lot that goes on with all of that. To kind of break down who I am, if you don't know already, my name is Brian Penny. I'm a freelance journalist. I've worked in media for quite a long time and on several different ways. So I started off as a paperboy back in the late 80s, early 90s. I was a newspaper carrier. So back in the day, before the internet, there was people got the newspaper delivered to them. There still are people that do that, but most people subscribe to an online subscription and don't worry about the actual physical thing unless it's a magazine. And during that time frame, I was a paperboy for a good 6 years, I want to say, during my childhood. Like, I started at 10 years old, and I held that thing, well, actually 8 years, because I held it all the way through my senior year of high school. Not through it, but it was my senior year of high school when I actually left. And during that time, I basically was part of the sales and marketing team. And customer service, all that. I would go through and deliver the newspapers. They would get delivered to me in a bundle. Then I would roll each individual one, and then move on and uh, send them out to all the subscribers that were not send them out, but go deliver them on my bicycle actually around the neighborhood. And then I'd go and collect all the money and do all that other stuff. And during that time, I got to meet a lot of the journalists that worked for this local newspaper. I got to meet a lot of people in charge of it, in fact, and I even got to, because I was the carrier of the month on a couple of months, I got to tour the place and learn a lot about journalism as a kid and how the newspaper worked. I was featured in the paper a few times when I was growing up, and that was always kind of a big deal to me. And since then, well, another part of this is that Sierra Vista Herald is one of the it's also owned. It's owned by a family business. It's about one of maybe 30 different news outlets that are owned by Wick Communications. This is Francis Wick, who is the now current CEO of Wick Communications. I actually went to school with him, so when I was doing all that stuff, it was his father that I was working for at the Herald, and I learned a lot about how the news works through all of that. But as time went on, I kind of got a job in banking, and I fell off and didn't really pay attention. I still watched the news as a news junkie, but I wasn't actually participating until 2011. When 2011 happened, what happened was I had leaked some information through Twitter and through a group, the hacktivist group Anonymous, and I was actually speaking to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal at the same time. And by that point, I had kind of a disdain for the mainstream media, and I there was a lot that was going on at the time. WikiLeaks had just come out, and this was January 2011, right after they did the Julian Assange and the Bradley Manning at the time leak, Chelsea Manning now, uh, and I ended up going around the media, and I ended up leaking some information through Anonymous. And because of that, I became the source of a global news story. It actually went all across the world, and it was kind of scary. I up to that point, I was kind of, well, pseudonymous at least, but mostly anonymous online. And the next thing I know, they're talking about me on Fox News, on MSNBC, on everywhere. The Wall Street Journal still published everything. Bloomberg, all sorts of places were publishing everything and were reaching out to contact me. And I had not ever been the story of a news outlet. I mean, not even really local news, much less on a state level or national level. And this was global news at the time. So I was terrified. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't know what to do. I through that summer and that year, that's when I started my own blog, and I worked independently to document my own story. But then I kind of went on and started doing some of the rounds on the regular news, and that's when HuffPost Live, back in the day, was actually a channel that Time Warner was running, where they basically were doing like a 24/7 news channel. Well, it wasn't 24/7. That's a lie. It was like 8 to 12 hours, give or take. And I spent a lot of time there, meeting a lot of the people there that worked there. People like Alana Minkowski was initially in Russia Today. I don't know if she's still even on TV. Alicia Menendez is doing MSNBC, I believe now. She was on HuffPost Live. Mark LeBrant Hill, I can't remember where he's at now. There's been Jacob Soboroff. There's quite a few journalists who, during that time frame, I got to meet. And I also got to meet a lot of the other people in the back end staff, so I got to learn a lot about how the TV news works versus the print media, and we're going to get into all of that in a minute. And that unfortunately didn't pay, so I ended up getting other jobs. I covered a lot of financial stuff with The Street, which is CNBC's Mad Money, Jim Cramer. This is his outlet that he owns online, and The Street does a lot of radio and podcasts. They basically take a lot of the opportunities that he gets from being on national media, and they use that to promote the brand and all of that other stuff. And I wrote a lot about the consumer facing side of finance for them. And then I covered crypto briefing. I covered a lot of cryptocurrency as a researcher and a writer for them. I did over 120, I want to say, give or take, coin guides, deep research dives. I did a lot of articles about the budding cryptocurrency industry that was going on from 2017 through now. It was about 2020, the beginning of 2020 and 2019 when I ended up walking away from that. I also covered the cannabis industry pretty deeply, for Cannabis Now and also for the Phoenix New Times, where I worked out of their office and from home, and leading into the pandemic and the legalization of Prop 200, I believe it was, and I can't even remember right now, which legalized recreational cannabis in Arizona in November 2020. So I have, I've worked for several years on each of these places where I've spent a lot of time working as a beat reporter, working as a written reporter. We'll get into some of the differences between everything. But then I've also done a lot of work where I've done editorials, where I'm published in places like Fast Company. This is the article I wrote in Forbes. You can find some of my stuff in High Times is kind of a gonzo journalist thing. A lot of this stuff is, if you actually click through and read some of the stuff. And then Paste Magazine was another one where I wrote a lot of, or I wrote some editorial stuff. And all of this is kind of, it makes it where it's difficult for you to understand like what's going on with the news. So to make this a little bit easier, we're going to start with a couple different breakdowns of what's going on and who is who in a newsroom. So you've got a bunch of different people that are all working, and when you have one of these professional newsrooms, a lot of the stuff will get outsourced for the smaller ones. When you get into the bigger ones, they have most everything is done in house. So you've got initially the producers. Some of this stuff is gonna be specific to certain newsrooms and not others, depending on what type of news they focus on, and we're gonna get into all of that soon. But you've got the producers. The producers are basically the ones who are making all of the segments. They're the ones who are, doing the writing, the hiring, the firing, the booking of everybody, the guests. They're doing. There might be other people that are under their staff that also do a lot of this stuff, but the producer is basically who's doing it. And in a lot of these newsrooms, they've got a ton of different producers. They've got segment producers, executive producers, all sorts of different things. Then you've got the news director, and the news directors are the ones who are basically the final say as to what is actually news. They're the ones who are, overseeing the entire operation to ensure that everything's fact checked. They're the ones who are deciding which stories to tell, getting whatever they can to verify everything that they possibly can. Then you've got the on-air talent. These are the people, there's a lot of different versions of them. There's the anchors, the news anchors, who are there to talk about a show. Then you've got the reporters, who are usually on the scene, and a lot of times, if they're talking about like Washington, D.C., there'll be an actual person with boots on the ground there. And then you've got like a meteorologist and things like that. And then you've got a lot of the guests. Guests will get booked on their guest experts. So pretty much any time that there's an actual news story, the news itself is kind of a boring thing when you really think about it. They tell all the facts from the story. They'll, like in the local news especially, they'll interview like the police chief, and they'll interview one of the people that was there. But then from that point, they just move on to the next story. Well, a lot of the national news, they spend a lot of their time on editorial things. So they're editorializing left and right, and they're adding in their own opinion and their own bias that gets in there. And then that's when they bring in, different experts. So if something happens with the stock market, they can bring in different stock investors or advisors or brokerage firms, things like that, where they're able to give their expert opinion on what they think the market's going to do. Everyone's speculating, obviously. I mean, the stock market in itself is a speculative market, but they will have other people that are talking. Even in political news, often you'll have people like C-SPAN, which is just broadcasting what's happening in the Capitol, and that with no commentary. But then during like the election, you'll have people coming on left and right that are doing different types of coverage on every broadcast news channel and every channel that there is. So it's not necessarily the candidates. You'll get all sorts of analysts and forecasters and advisors and all these other people that are in the industry giving their opinions on everything. And that's kind of what they're there for. They're experts. They have educated opinions, but they're still giving an opinion versus doing of their own perspective versus doing the research and the fact checking and the verification that the journalists are going through. And a lot of that, the top parts of it are mostly delegated to the cable news, TV news, and the radio news. So any of the audio or video. Written news, doesn't have on-air talent, although you're going to see a lot of the places like the New York Times, which is a traditional newspaper, it still has videos that it does, and it still has on-air talent. So all of these lines are getting blurred by everything, and we'll get into that a little bit too, by how the internet is blurring all of this. And then you've got the writers and editors are doing a lot of the bulk work. They're the ones who are securing the interviews with the original sources, verifying with whoever was there with any witnesses what's going on. They're the ones who are checking the court documents. They're going through and they're writing the story around it. Every single news outlet, they have their own editorial direction, their own voice, and what they're trying to do. And the writers and editors are very much responsible for that. Even if it's broadcast news on the radio or on TV, they're still, there's a script that's behind it. They're all reading off of a teleprompter. All of this stuff is pre-written and it's edited. On top of that, it goes through a layer of fact checkers. And the fact checkers will go through and take any number, any name, anything that's going on there. They'll recall or call back on any of the sources that you've talked to, just to make sure that there's a second person that's there. Anytime, especially when you get to, it's not so bad with the local news, but it still can be a problem. I mean, even independents like myself can have issues with that. But when you get up to the national news level, you get a lot of people who are basically liable to sue the company for anything that you report. So you've got to have, as many eyes as you can have on everything before it gets read on air, or it's published in wherever it's going. And that's a lot of the meat and potatoes of what's going on with there. Then on top of that, you've got the AV and graphics, the audio, the video, and the graphics. So when you get into the graphics are for everybody, but then when you get into the broadcasting and the radio, you're going to have audio and visual elements. That means you've got to get music that's got to be original, or you got to license it and pay for all those licenses. You've got to have graphic designers that are making all of the fancy graphics that are going on in the lower thirds and all the other kind of things that are happening. And then you've got people that are running the broadcasting booth. There are people that are checking all the satellite feeds or the internet feeds, whatever it is that's going on at that point. There's people that are scheduling. Then you've got the actual platform, which is the broadcaster or the publisher. That in itself is an entire business that doesn't even. I mean, it's just the way every business is, regardless of what the product is. The product and service here happens to be news, but it's just like any other operational thing. You've got human resources, you've got accounting, you've got a sales and marketing team. When I was working as a paper boy, that's essentially what I worked as. You've got customer service. A lot of different things that are going on, because I mean, if you've ever watched the news, there's commercials that are going on during it, and if you've ever read the news, you've got ads that are going on in there. And as much as the journalists like to say that they have no bias and they have they're not worried about advertisers, the fact is that every news outlet is worried about money. Most of them are publicly traded companies. You've got like Gannett, you've got Thomson Reuters, you've got New York Times. All of these are publicly traded companies, and much less all the broadcasting companies, which are all owned by some other public traded company. So there is money involved. There's advertisers involved. The cancel culture can happen in the news just like it can in the entertainment media. This is something that's going to, especially for on-air talent. If you're in the background, you've pretty much got a free pass to go do whatever you want. Nobody knows who you are. But when you're on-air talent, or you're the front-facing face of that channel, you can very quickly face cancel culture for anything that you say on the news, and misquoting things, being too aggressive. There's all sorts of problems that can happen. We've seen tons of people lose their jobs at major news stations over the past couple of years, and most recently it's Chris Kelly, who's suspended from CNN. You've got people like Chris Cuomo. And then you got people like Megyn Kelly. Then you've got Bill O'Reilly and a lot of other people who have kind of gone out from, or left one way or another, their news stuff. And this happens outside of there too. I mean, we see people all the time on internet or written news outlets that move somewhere else. Glenn Greenwald is a great example of somebody who was doing initially, I believe it was The Guardian he was writing for, and Salon, and then all of a sudden he shifted over to they created their own The Intercept, and he's since left there. The same thing with the Huffington Post's I can't remember his name right now, but their former political writer also is now working at The Intercept. There's a lot of people that will shift around to different news outlets, and a lot of that, I mean, there's a lot of back end stuff that goes on behind the curtains of all of these things that you don't really think about. And this is kind of leading into how we get into fake news and how people don't really trust what's happening on the news. People don't really they think that something like CNN or Fox News, they're pointing their fingers at each other because one of them serving the left and one of them serving the right in the political realm, and they're calling each other fake news. And a lot of their followers would just believe this point blank. Like, for example, John Hannity is a great example. He's not actually really doing news. He's not a news anchor. He's a host. He's not a reporter. Basically, he's giving his opinion and he's editorializing, and he's basically the same as the editorial section or the opinion section of any newspaper. He's giving his opinion based off what's going on, but he's not necessarily just reading the facts basically. And this happens everywhere. So no matter which news outlet that you actually trust, there's going to be some fact, there's going to be some opinion. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, whether you're on the middle. A lot of what people are trying to say is fake news. They focus on the political news even, and that's kind of short-sighted too, because you've got the consumer news, business news, crypto and cannabis, for example. Both those industries have their own news outlets and that follow those industries. Agriculture, there's news that goes on in there that's happening, and a lot of this stuff can all be affected very easily by money, by corporate interests and political interests. There's all sorts of reasons in which people are basically trying to get their opinion out onto these channels. So it's not just CNN and Fox. They're the ones that will sit there and bump heads, all the left and the right. It's not just these two outlets. Everybody on the left and the right does it. But they are pointing fingers at each other and trying to say that each one of them is lying when they're giving the same perspective, or different perspectives of the same events that go on. And it gets kind of dicey. You never know what to believe. You never know what's happening. And you have other issues when you go between the mainstream media and independent media, because there's a lot of people who just don't trust the media. When they say that, they mean they don't trust the mainstream media, but they still get their news from other places, from blogs, from newsletters, TikTok videos, Twitter, even Facebook. There's a lot of other places that you can spread the news. I've been in several Facebook groups for my local places in southern Arizona, where basically that's what we're doing. Is everybody there is kind of following the court system and following the police scanners and things like that. You have actual journalists, you've got lawyers, you got all the people in the community that are interested in news, that are coming together and speaking about things. And it's not really a replacement of the mainstream media, because down there we'll still read the local newspaper, the Sierra Vista Herald, the Tucson News, and watch the news. But at the same time, you've also got to look for other sources to get other news, because like today, for example, everyone's talking about the Omicron virus, the Omicron variant of the coronavirus. Last week, it was all about Kyle Rittenhouse and everything that was going on around that, or 2 weeks ago. I don't know how long it's been at this point. And, you get these stories that stick in people's minds, and everybody, wants to learn more about it. So the news stations will continue covering it. And some of it kind of, it goes viral just like anything else. And you don't really get like the full amount of news the full spectrum when you just focus on one or two stations. You've got to really watch everything. You've got to be able to scan around and everything. And not everybody really has time to do that. So we're going to kind of break down how a lot of this goes. I've got four different sections here of the different types of news. Now, first, we've got broadcast news. And so that's basically what we were just showing with Sean Hannity. That's the all of the people that get on TV, that put on hair and makeup, that get the lighting correct, get the cameras on, and do what they have to do for news. Each one of these has they're basically reaching the largest audience. Broadcast news has a massive audience. It's national. It gets, even international. It goes online. Everything is being discussed, and it's the way to get the breaking news to the biggest audience as possible. And a lot of the we talked about the death of news, like the newspapers and the cable news outlets and all of that stuff, but they're all still getting these really large audiences. They're still the most effective way of spreading a message, and there's even more that have popped up. Initially, when you think about it, we had the major news stations, I can't even think of what they're called right now, but the basic cable, essentially, or the non-cable, the network. There we go, network news. We had 3 and eventually 4 when Fox came on, and then you had cable news that kind of expanded that out to another dozen or so outlets. And now that we have the internet, we've had so many different outlets that have popped up with different things that you have a lot of brands and news bureaus that didn't really exist 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, some of them. And so the lines are kind of getting blurred between everything. But the broadcast news, There's also other things to look out for, because a lot of them, when you're looking up, and we have the obvious with like CNN and Fox, where they're very biased to the left or right. You have other things that are like Newsmax and others that are obviously biased one way or another. But you've got to kind of have a full range of what you're looking at. You've got to be able to get both sides of the stories. You've got to be able to look at it. But then you've also have things like Bloomberg and Cheddar, which try to focus mostly on business. This is a whole other aspect of it, because it's not just the political agendas that everybody's trying to advance. You've also got financial interests. You've got every company in the world wants to be on the news. Essentially, every single person believes that they're newsworthy. And I working in journalism, I get buried in PR press releases like all the time. And it's what it is, just a bunch of people that are paying an entire industry of people just to get on the news. And sometimes you end up on there as a commentator, and you're able to provide analysis that's relevant to your company. Sometimes you're on there as the story, because for one reason or another, maybe a shooting happened in your business's parking lot, or maybe you had some unique thing going on for the holidays, or some unique tactics, so that you become the story yourself. But getting onto the national news and the broadcast news is probably one of the hardest things to do. The On top of this, you have stuff like Vice. What Vice is doing on HBO, they take everything even further, where they've got boots on the ground, and they're basically making documentary style news. And documentaries are a whole other thing, where it's presented as though it's fact, and it is a nonfiction work, but there is still something that's being told. It's just like reality TV. There's a story that's meant to be told, and they're going to kind of follow that script. I've done some interviews with NPR and BBC that where I've been able to figure out, like, they'll do like an hour interview with you. You're giving them all this stuff, and they're only really taking like a 30-second to 1 minute quote, and like in 30-second segments even, and piecing it all together and saying, well, yeah, you said this. Like, well, yeah, but that wasn't really the context of why it was done and all this other things. But they knew how to get the answers that they needed to get out of there. And so when you're doing all this kind of like unscripted, scripted kind of thing, it gets kind of dicey. I mean, it's just like all of the documentaries that you get on Netflix. People will watch these documentaries, true crime kind of things, and kind of take that as, well, this is what happened. And yeah, there was a lot of research and investigation, all that stuff that went into it. It's just like anywhere else, where there's going to be some kind of a bias. There's going to be they're going to lead you towards believing something one way or another. I believe the Tiger King was the most recent example of that on Netflix, where they clearly showed that something that looked like the woman had murdered some people, and there was a lot of criminal stuff going on. And it's kind of hard to say. Everyone's pointing their fingers at each other between Carol Baskin, I can't remember the guy's name right now, but it starts to get kind of gray area at that point. And then to make things worse, you've got people like Trevor Noah and John Oliver, who are comedians who are basically giving the news. There's all sorts of versions of comedy news that happens, and there's a whole level of person who only gets their news from from comedians, from Saturday Night Live, from John Oliver and The Daily Show and all these kind of things, or even the late night comedy shows. So there's, on this level of broadcast, it's typically aimed at either a global or a national audience. So you have the biggest audience possible, and a lot of the stuff that goes on here, they're the last people to report on it. Basically, you will have local news report on something to death, or it just won't be reported at all for a long time. But you'll have some written outlets and all these other things that'll write something long before it ever gets on to broadcast news, because it's reaching the largest audience. There's the highest legal liability, and so they've got to have as much solid footing as possible before they report something, and so they're often the last people to jump on the bandwagon. So then you have radio news. Radio news is I think is going to be making a comeback. A lot of they said initially, back when television first came out, there's the whole thing on MTV about how video killed the radio star. And this is kind of true, because there was a lot of things with the introduction of TV where somebody, one of the most famous examples was the presidential debate between Richard Nixon and JFK, where It's one of the first televised, or the first televised debate, and Nixon had a perfect radio voice, and anybody who was listening to the radio broadcast thought that he was the, the more intelligent person, had the best arguments, and had the best vision for everything. But everybody who was watching kind of saw this good-looking JFK and this charismatic character versus this guy who was not really fit for television in Richard Nixon. And I mean, that election, Nixon lost and JFK won, and that kind of shows you. I mean, that kind of thing has happened all the way up through Trump. Trump was, and Obama even, they were very good on camera. They very much were charismatic, and so they did well on TV, and they still were able to get the majority vote. But there's still a lot of people who will stick to radio. Radio is a lot easier. It takes off a lot of the production. You don't have to worry about hair, makeup, any of the video aspects of it, and it's easier to talk than it is to basically write. The downside to it is that there's going to be fewer people that are listening to you than there are who would have been watching you. But for people who are trying to get the news out as fast and most efficiently as possible, this is kind of a great middle ground to do that. Then you have the print news, which is the written news. And this is all of the newspapers, the magazines, all the blogs and websites and all of that kind of stuff. This is the newsroom of the New York Times. And basically all of these outlets, it's kind of funny at this point to kind of say that there's a difference between the written and any of these other ones, because the New York Times, for example, does do podcasts. They do some TV stuff, or video stuff at least, on different social media outlets, and they will show up on TV as a lot of the written people will show up on TV as the guest analyst, because ultimately journalists prefer to talk to other journalists about what's happening on their beat before they pull in some kind of marketing person or somebody who's just there to kind of promote their business or themselves. They get a lot of those kind of people within the news. And this is where a lot of the news happens, basically. It'll go through, it'll get researched by the writers. A lot of them will tell you that they're not that great on camera, they're not that great on podcasts maybe, but they do know how to dig into the news. They've got all the research skills that they need. They've got all the different sites up that they need to be able to check into whatever they have to. And they are, you'll get a lot of battles between the written news journalists versus the broadcast news journalists, especially the anchors, about who's a real reporter, who's just an actor. On HuffPost Live, that was something that did actually happen. You would see people like Mark Lamont Hill and Alicia Menendez, who are still anchoring in the news, and they would be paired up with actors several times as their partners and their co-anchors. And it's because, basically certain people will try to get any screen time they possibly can because they couldn't get hired in Hollywood, or they don't maybe know how to act or do any of the other kind of things, but they do want to have the screen time and get on there. So there's an entire you don't really necessarily have to have a journalism degree to be on TV, but you're more likely to need one when you're doing like written stuff. On the written end of it, it's still kind of a catch-22 when you're the writer, because you still have editors, you still have people that can change your wording around and make it look like you're saying things that you're not. You have to take responsibility sometimes for things that an editor said, and that's a lot of reasons why you'll see when if you were to complain to a newspaper outlet saying that they got something wrong, they tend to, it's kind of like the police officers or soldiers or anybody that's on a team or part of a group, they protect their own. And so they know, as the editors, that other things happen, that the writer might not have been responsible for the title or the subtitle or the snippet, or some of the things like the quotes are typically not messed with, but for the most part, everything around it is fair game. At any given point, you can turn in an article and have it be completely different than what it was you actually turned in. Then we've got the internet. The internet has changed everything, because like I was saying in the other part of it, there used to be kind of a difference between like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the written outlets versus the video outlets and versus the radio outlets. But now you're at a point where everybody from CNET and Wired all the way up to Politico and all these other places, NPR, BBC, they're all doing everything. They're doing the broadcast, they're doing the radio, the written news, and everything else. And we've opened it up to other outlets at this point because they're competing with everybody else. You've got the Young Turks was a great example of St. Uger. I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, but he initially, back in 2011, when I had the story drop on me with Anonymous and Bank of America, he was actually working at NBC. He was the anchor at MSNBC. He was the anchor on that show that was covering at the time. And he's since moved on to do his own independent news stuff. And then you've got someone like going even further, like Phil Defranco, who covers a lot of the internet news that you don't really find in a lot of other places. He covers a lot of the influencer economy, the creator economy, all of the people on TikTok and Instagram and all those kind of things. He does do a lot of politics and a lot of national news, things like that, but he's representing like a whole new layer of news that's been going on through social media. And I mean, even Phil DeFranco, he's in his mid to late 30s at this point, and so he's no longer representing even the younger people either. And you've got people on TikTok that are doing versions of him that he's now competing with. Then we've got, on top of this, there is social audio and social media that's going on. And Twitter is a fucking great place to look at all of this stuff, because Twitter over the last 12 years has been a lot of different things. I mean, there are reporters who all they really do is report on what's going on Twitter. If you follow enough celebrities and important people on Twitter and just listen to what they're typing and go through, or tweeting, and go through and report on that, you can make an entire career out of that. Reddit's the same thing, where there are a lot of people, less serious outlets, who will basically write things about like the BuzzFeeds of the world or the Huffington Post, that will write things based off of what Reddit is doing. Because I mean, you can see where 15,000 people are commenting and agreeing on a post. You can kind of gather what's going on and make a story out of that. But the introduction of social audio, which is Twitter Spaces on Twitter, there's a lot of other places, Clubhouse, Spotify's got their own Green Room app. But the introduction of social audio has added a whole new layer to this, because now we've got people who didn't really fit in any of the other outlets and any other mediums, and now they've got live audio. And live audio has given rise to a whole new layer of creator at this point. And so you've got a lot of things that are going on here, where there's outlets like The Street, Good Morning America, and I'm trying to think, CNBC I've seen on there, some other ones, Motley Fool, Benzinga, that will do social audio rooms. And they'll do basically a podcast, and they'll use the social audio for the promotion of it and to gather audience members so that they can publish the podcast somewhere else. Then you've got things like this middle one is what happened on Twitter the day that Jack Dorsey left. There was an entire race war that got triggered, basically, that from Monday of this week. And it was crazy. There was thousands of people in rooms on either side of it that were calling for essentially the extermination of the white race on one end, and then our genocide of the white race on one end, and then on the other end we had people like Richard Spencer, who's a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist, who was running his own rooms. And all of this kind of stuff is showing where Twitter was always kind of a place that was making news. Even back in the Occupy days, the Arab Spring, all of that stuff that was going on, that was all Twitter. That was Twitter that broke it. That was activism happened on Twitter, journalism happened on Twitter. A lot of things were going on. And we're kind of getting to that point again, where on this last one, you see there's a lot of politicians that are also now getting involved, where they're, the conservative side especially, I haven't really seen as much on the liberal side, but there has been a little bit of it going on. But the conservative movement has definitely been kind of activating and mobilizing a grassroots movement to get voters, interested. Leading into this next year's election, this is going to get more and more important, where on every end, I really think Twitter Spaces is something that's going to control things more than Facebook. We got used to talking about the how Facebook kind of meddled in the election and how all these different things might have happened on Facebook, and Twitter is somehow managed to not end up in that conversation as much as it really should. And since it, in January, when it removed President Trump, there's been a lot of stuff that's been going on where Twitter, especially this week, a few other things have gone on where they've hired a bunch of people that are a lot more woke, a lot more progressive, that are really censoring what's going on and trying to kind of minimize the voices of a lot of the conservative right. And meanwhile, they're promoting a lot of the leftist ideals, and it's making it basically where social media is just as biased as a lot of the mainstream media, where a lot of it seems to be, for the most part, biased to the left. But even that is kind of it's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Fallacy, because they still have corporate interests, and even the liberal media, when they're going through, they still have advertisers. They might be going through advertisers that are they're trying to get to people that are more liberal, but a lot of them won't specifically say that they're liberal. They're just doing that because they're trying to reach the broadest possible people for the advertisers that the advertisers want to reach. So to kind of break everything down, this is really how you should be looking at the news. You've got the mainstream media versus independent. So you've got the people like the big corporations like the New York Times, which is a publicly traded company, versus the guy in the Facebook group who is doing the same thing. He's spreading news, doing local news, all that kind of things. Then you've got the national media versus local. Now, national media, something, anybody that comes in through the news, whether it's a story, whether it's a person, any of it, it starts at local. Any of the anchors that you see on national TV, they started local. Any of the stories that you've seen on national TV, they started local. Local journalism is key to everything that's going on in the world. They are the ones who are breaking the stories. They're the ones with the boots on the ground. They're the ones that are doing all of the digging in their hometowns, and they're the ones who are talking to the people and understand how this affects their community. When some story gets big enough, they realize it's of national interest, then it goes up to the national scale. One of the great examples of this was that's kind of recent, because Ghislaine Maxwell is still on trial right as we speak. But Jeffrey Epstein was something that was broke by the Palm Beach Post. So because he lived in Palm Beach, the local news in Palm Beach was the one that was like really covering what was going on to their local person. But because he ends up having all of these connections, he's a billionaire who's very connected to a lot of powerful and wealthy people, then it becomes national interest and everybody wants to know about it. But the only reason the national news was able to do all of what they did was because of the reporting that was going on, the investigative reporting from the Palm Beach Post reporter. And so then what you have when you decide, there will be things, and especially in middle America, this isn't so much in LA and New York, because what they decide is important really kind of goes everywhere. In Chicago, I guess, would be another news hub. But when you get to small town America, you've got basically the stories that happen in your small town, like when a robbery happens there. It's not, when you get robbed, for example, it's not really newsworthy. But when Kim Kardashian gets robbed, it's newsworthy on a national level. And you have these national outlets are deciding, basically based off of what content they want for their audiences and for their advertisers, what stories they're going to pick and choose from the local news to broadcast. And that's where you get into the political and corporate bias. Now, this is, all news is biased. Everyone tries to tell you that they're going to be unbiased, and everyone tries to be unbiased and just look at the facts, and there's always going to be a little bit of bias that's going in there. And the fact is that, I mean, you don't want to. You could read a lot of the same things the news reporting. They're looking at the court docs. They're looking at public records, things like that. You could just do that yourself, but you don't want to. You want to be entertained. Is the reality of that. And in order to be entertained, they've got to have money. In order to get money, they've got to make money, and they've got to appease the higher ups. And so all of this bias kind of ends up to the point where you as a regular person sees the news outlets that you can't trust. But you end up going to somebody else who's, like, for example, myself. I'm working by myself. I have I have connections. I have people that I can talk to verify things. I can talk directly to sources and do what I have to do. But I mean, for the last 2 years, year, no, it's been 2 now at this point. Man, coronavirus makes the time kind of go by fast. But I've basically been working for myself versus reporting to one of the news outlets. And even on my own end, I mean, I'm obviously going to have bias. There are things that I'm interested in. There are things that I'm not. It's not that I am trying to promote one thing over another. It's just that I know how to speak on certain topics. I do not know how to speak on other topics. But based off of that, people will gain will see the bias, the political bias, the business bias, all those kind of things. My personal bias that goes into that, just by the mere fact of what I'm selecting as a story to cover. And it's difficult because when you're working by yourself, you've got all these other things to do. You have all those other people that are in the newsroom that are that are there working as a team. You can have somebody just doing graphics, somebody just doing fact checking, somebody just doing audio. I have to do all of this stuff on my own. It's not easy going through and doing something. By the time I were to be able to break some story, like it would already have been broken by somebody else. And so I've got to dig in and find other stories that could be of use. And a lot of what I've been doing to fill in the gap is the evergreen content that, this will still be relevant. All of this stuff about what the media is still going to be relevant 20, 30 years from now. There might be a few changes here and there, but overall, this video is going to remain relevant for a long time. It's an evergreen content versus when I cover, so I don't try to cover politics a lot, because who's in charge in American politics is going to change every 4 years, every 2 to 4 years. And so there's really no point in covering what's going on when it just doesn't become relevant anymore. There's a lot of topical stuff that if you covered Donald Trump 10 years ago, it doesn't really make a difference versus today. So there's a lot of different things that go on that happen to where it may not be because somebody's trying to kill a story. It may not be anything like that. They just don't have the interest in it. They don't believe that their audience has an interest in it. And all of this kind of goes back into the fake news thing where people don't trust the media. People have a insane distrust for the media, and there's a good reason why. I mean, there is a lot of money in the back end and a lot of things that you don't really realize that go on. Much less are people having trouble determining the ads from the editorials versus the actual news. And even when you're writing any of that stuff, there's always another person whose hands are going to get on it, and your name may be attached as the journalist, but it may not be exactly what you said. And then on top of that, you've got lawyers involved that are protecting everybody from lawsuits, because people don't sometimes like to have their personal business or their any of this stuff going out on into the public. And so it gets to the point where it's difficult. I wish I've been talking for almost an hour now. I wish I could have an answer for you as to like, this is what you should trust. This is what you should do. This is how to navigate everything. But the fact is that you really can't tell. You can't tell when somebody tells you they're a journalist, whether or not they really are. You can't tell if somebody's actually working for a company that they say that they are. They might say that they work for HuffPost or CNN or Fox or any of these places, but they don't. They're a freelancer or not even a paid person. They're just a free guest. And there are people that will exploit every side of this and will try to do whatever they can in order for, to advance their own career, to appease the higher ups, to do whatever, to get an agenda out there. Sometimes you never know what somebody's actual agenda is, and you can't really tell just by reading their social media or whatever they post in public, whatever they write in their newspaper. And on top of this, we've got everything's decentralized, and we've got stuff like Substack, where you see a lot of like Glenn Greenwald's on there, a lot of other journalists are using that to go independent, because at the end of the day, the media is just like everything else. They're all unionizing. They're keeping a lot of freelancers out because they need to save money, because they need to protect their corporate interests. They need to make money. They need to provide the benefits and all the other things that are going on. And the journalists are trying not to lose their jobs, but a lot of them are finding out that if they get in a big enough audience from national TV, from appearing on a big enough platform, and they can get a following, that they can monetize that by doing their own independent news. And once you get up to 10 to 50,000 followers anywhere, you can pretty much monetize that and make an okay living. I've seen people do it on Facebook, on Twitter, on Clubhouse even, and Clubhouse isn't even that big of a platform. But the key to it all is to make sure that you have when you are a consumer and a reader of the news, that you keep an eye on everything. If there's only one person talking about it, check their sources, kind of dig in, think about like how reliable and reputable this person actually is. If it's being reported by multiple outlets, that's something that you've also, it feels like you could trust it, but you still need to check, because sometimes reporters get lazy, their editors get lazy, fact checkers get lazy, things slip through the cracks sometimes, and you never really know what is what's going to happen. And when you get to these small independent outlets, they will let a lot of stuff slip, and it's not because they're not trying. They're still trying to put the facts out there. They're still trying to report on the truth, but there's so many different working parts to all of this. They've got to be on social media. They've got to be, operating cameras and mics and all this other kind of stuff. They've got to be on their phone checking up on what's going on. And there's just so many different pieces that need to go right. And I mean, that's why I don't do daily news on here. I would love if I could just sit here all day and do daily news, but I would need at least like 3 or 4 people behind me that are able to find the news and verify everything before I actually talk about it on air. And it's just not worth it. So that's why I kind of stick with what I'm doing. But this there's no real answer. There's no way to find out who you can really trust. Even the people that you trust can make mistakes. You've got to be able to take everything with a grain of salt. Keep an eye on all the news. Make sure that you understand the facts that are going on. But I mean, when you really need to dig into things and make sure that you understand what's really happening, see it for yourself. Watch enough videos. Like the Kyle Rittenhouse thing is a great example of a lot of different things. One, it's a political bias, just because anybody who's covering that trial is typically doing so because of the politics involved, versus the fact that there's this kid who is on trial for adults attacking him, and now he's got his whole life that's basically being destroyed from it. And I went through, when all that stuff happened, I immediately went through social media because there was videos that were everywhere that I was able to see exactly what was happening. That may not be true anymore because Twitter is now, changing their media policy to where all of those videos that I watched in order to get the truth of what happened wouldn't have been there. But people had their cameras out all the time. They're constantly recording, and during a lot of newsworthy events, you can look all of the stuff that's happening and trace it all for yourself and figure out who's there and who's not, and reach out to the people yourself. But you can't really trust everybody to do it for you, no matter who it is, no matter who your favorite journalist is or what outlet it is, how reputable they are. There's chances they can make mistakes. There's an obvious bias that's going on, and they're, at the end of the day, they're picking and choosing what stories they want to air to their audience that's going to appease them, and all of those factors kind of come into play when you're looking at a story and figuring out what's fake and what's real. It's not really an easy answer. There's fake and there's real news everywhere, and it's not always easy to tell one way or another. It's not a specific thing that's just left or right or even political. Every type of news, whether it's video game journalism, whether it's product reviews that you're reading, whether it's movie reviews or even celebrity gossip, sporting stuff, all of it. It's all, there's all bias in there. There's all things that can be right and wrong, and you've got to take everything with a grain of salt and keep an eye open and an open mind, and don't be fooled by any of it, and make sure that you know what you're talking about before you start spreading any news to your friends and family about what may or may not have happened. The biggest thing, when I got into the media, it was as a whistleblower, and the reason I stay, I used whistleblower more than I used journalist in my title, is because I believe in the truth. I believe that no matter what, that you should be presenting the facts as they occurred. You should be teaching people things that actually happened, and that's very important to me. That's one of my guiding principles as to why I do what I do. But that's also why I can't post as often as I want to, because I don't always have the time to do all the back end research, because it takes a lot of work I'm doing live streams, and it's not, I'm doing a lot of it stream of thought, but I have to get my thoughts straight. I have to do a lot of research in order to do that. But that's basically the everything that you need to know about the news. Obviously, I'll be covering a lot of this stuff probably a couple times a year. I'm going to try to at least go in here and talk some more about the media stuff. But yeah, stay tuned to this channel. I'm going to do everything that I can to cover as much tech, finance, and interesting things that need to be known as I possibly can over the next decade, and we're going to go from there and see what happens. Again, my name is Brian Penny. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
That moment in someone's life where they're trying to figure out who they are and what their identity is, it just gets magnified, and it becomes a bigger thing, because fame is tricky, because you read what's said about you, then you know what you know to be true, and the lines start to blur.